So, mid February, Bloomberg News reported that the Department of Homeland Security had removed gender identity and sexual orientation as two protected identities from personnel being allowed to conduct intelligence activity. And what that means is being allowed to track anyone based on gender identity or sexual orientation. Now, I have to say, as of this recording today, when I clicked on the link that took me to the Department of Homeland Security, where that statement was of the protected identities, it currently says that page is not there, where it was there 2 weeks ago. But as of today, it's not there. Regardless, this had been reported by Bloomberg News and other such news agencies that those two identities, gender identity and sexual orientation, had been removed as protected identities, meaning that personnel from the Department of Homeland Security could start tracking people based on those identities alone. Now, as a physician, you might be like, why do I need to know this? And I think there are three main reasons that many healthcare providers would want to know. The first one is that many tell me I had no idea. And I had no idea not only that this happened, but how this affects transgender and non binary patients and their family. The second reason, as I often say, is that as physicians in social gatherings, you are the person that people often go to. We often hear, "You're a doctor. What do you think?" And so, for those situations, if a topic like this comes up, that you have had a chance to think about it and understand it to be able to formulate an opinion and answer those questions. And the third reason is in this in particular, it has an effect on the relationship between you and your patients. And I'll explain why throughout this podcast. Now, as I mentioned, this is a policy that is stating that it's no longer going to protect these identities. And for the sake of this podcast, based on my specialty and what I talk mainly about, I'm going to focus on gender identity. And so, what does that mean? Well, I immediately thought back to after the election, and many of the social media influencers that I follow were making jokes, as well as some friends making jokes, kind of jokes, one of those things like you either joke or you laugh or you cry, of comments. Well, they're going to take us all away. Well, they're going to gather us up and take us all away, and making that kind of joke. Well, this is playing on that fear because it begs the question, what would they do that for? Why would they want to track people based on their gender identity? What would they use that information for? And for families that have children who are transgender or non-binary, this hits on some of their fears as well. Many of these families with transgender or non-binary children have a fear that their children will be taken away, that if the government starts tracking who has transgender children, that this may lead to Child Protective Services, to being accused of child abuse and having their children removed and detransitioned. A lot of times people hear about these fears and they think there are debates of whether they're legitimate or not. And I think that's kind of wasted energy because it doesn't really matter whether anyone else thinks they're legitimate or not. The truth of the matter is, if the person in front of you, if the patient in front of you, that is their fear, it doesn't really matter what you think is legitimate or not because it's legitimate to them. It's how they feel. And it's not based on nothing. So, for example, for that parent or guardian with a child who is transgender, you can say, well, they won't do that. They can't do that. It wouldn't be legal. A lot of these things, when they are policy, may not be legal, may not hold up in court. And that's a phrase I often hear. It won't hold up in court. That may be true, but the time it takes from the time action is taken upon a policy to the time it can get to the courts and be stopped, things can happen in that time. And you don't have to look far to see an example of that. You can just look at Texas in 2022 when the governor and the attorney general made a policy to have Child Protective Services look into any child that had received gender affirming care and to investigate those families for child abuse. Now, yes, it got overturned in the courts and stopped, but not before families began to get investigated for child abuse. And those families and their children were affected by those investigations and the fear and the anxiety of being taken out of their homes. So yes, it's a policy and it might get overturned in court, but damage can be done. And so there's a fear that now some of these protections may be disappearing and people may not want to be visible. Families may not want to be outspoken because if anything like that happens, they don't want to be seen as first. They don't want to be the first one to pop into mind to be like, oh, I know somebody who is transgender. And that's why a lot of these families are putting together safe folders. Folders, and I've mentioned this in previous podcasts, folders where they are getting letters of support from healthcare providers, so they may ask you for that. Healthcare providers, educators, community members, religious leaders, family members, all to talk about their child, how others see their child, how others see the relationship with their child, that demonstrate that there is no abuse going on. They are also asking people that they know to please be quiet and not share that their child is transgender, to try to protect their family, to keep it out of people's minds, out of fear of this tracking, out of fear that if some policy changes of child abuse, that they're not going to be the ones thought of. That if they're starting to take names, that their name is not on the top of people's minds to report them. And that is one thing I think as providers that we can do. It is really common in those social gatherings that I was talking about when people come to you and they're like, you're a doctor, what do you think, right? They often also come and say, I know this kid. And one thing I think we can do is just set the groundwork at the beginning. The minute you say, I know, you hear somebody say, I know, it's like, hold on a second, hold on a second, hold on a second. Before we talk about this, I think we should all come into agreement because I think we all want to keep everyone safe and the best of our abilities, that we don't talk about any specific person. We can only talk about ourselves and we can only talk about people in general. And that is one way as a physician, you can be a leader in some of these discussions that happen, regardless of what your opinion is. I think we all want to keep everybody safe. And you can be a leader in reminding people we're not going to talk about any specific person here in public. So back to the idea of this policy that transgender, non-binary people could be, and we don't know if they are or they aren't, but could be tracked if so desired by the government based on policy at this point. So there is some history, even before the policy changed, of government trying to get lists of people who are transgender, whether in Texas, the governor asking for lists of kids that are receiving gender affirming care and investigating them for child abuse, whether in Texas, the list from the DMV of people who have changed their name and gender markers, or even just recently, I think last week in Florida, many people who had changed their driver's license to change their gender marker on their driver's license in the past have received letters recently saying they're not going to be changed. They're going to match your sex and you're getting a new driver's license changed back. Which means they have to go through the records to do that. They're looking through the names. But I promised you I would talk to you about how this relates to medicine and your relationship with the patient. Now, you might be thinking, yeah, but we have HIPAA. We're not going to tell about our patients. But someone has. It's already happened. In 2022, the Tennessee Attorney General was investigating Medicaid fraud and asked Vanderbilt Medical Center for all its records on all its transgender patients for the past 5 years. Now, this was not only just happening to Vanderbilt, there were a few different states asking different medical centers for their list of transgender patients. Some hospitals went to court and fought it. Some refused to give it. Vanderbilt gave it. Now, there is a part of HIPAA that says you protect patients unless legally obligated to give the information. But there is a question whether or not Vanderbilt did enough to protect those patients. What we do know is they handed that list over. Now, it wasn't discovered that Vanderbilt did this for almost a year. And it was discovered when the ACLU was investigating a case and looking over some records that it realized Vanderbilt had handed over these records. Now, this is important because when a medical center, when any medical institution or physician has to hand over medical records of a patient that they're legally obligated to hand over, they can disclose to the patient, they can tell the patient that happened and explain that happened and why, that they were legally obligated to do it, as long as there's not a gag order from the court. There was no gag order for the court. So Vanderbilt could have notified all their patients that they had to release the information to the attorney general. But they didn't. They made the decision not to notify their patients. So it only came out when the ACLU found it in the records a year later, about a year later. And I tell you this because we can get into right or wrong and all this stuff. I will tell you that in the U.S. Senate hearings, they found that Vanderbilt did not do enough to protect their patients. I don't know all the details to know why they didn't do what other hospitals did and try to fight it in court. Regardless of the reasoning, it had an effect on the trust of transgender and non-binary patients. For those that know that story, it occurred in 2022, but it wasn't public knowledge till 2023. For those that know the story, that a hospital system handed over a list of all the transgender patients and all of their records on gender affirming care of the past 5 years to the attorney general without notifying them even after the fact or putting up at least somewhat of a fight. It broke the trust. Now you could say, but hold on a second. You said there were other hospitals that did fight and did it. What about them? Yes, but which one would you focus on? That one instance makes it no longer possible to say, hey, you're safe here. We'd never share because it's already happened. And technically, legally, Vanderbilt didn't do anything wrong. There is just a question of whether they did enough to protect their patients. But legally, they didn't break the law. So what can you do as a physician? Because knowing this information, knowing that gender identity might be gone from the Department of Homeland Security policy of protection against intelligence activity for an identity, knowing this background on disclosing lists of patients from medical centers, then it can be understandable that some patients may not disclose to you their gender identity if they are not out. Some patients may not share about their family with you, may not share some of what they're going through as a family if they have family members who are transgender and non-binary that they're thinking about, they're worrying about. Does that mean you can't provide them good medical care? No, it doesn't mean that. But you're not going to have the same connection. You're not going to have the same rapport. There's always going to be a little bit of guardedness between you and them. What can you do? I think what you can do is be really transparent with them. If you have a transgender or non-binary patient, and this might be good with all patients I think most patients wonder, what do you put in my chart and what don't you? If someone's disclosing things with you, you might start at the beginning of any appointment with a patient and say, what you share today, I put most of what you share today in your medical record. If there's anything you don't want me to share, please let me know. If I think it needs to be in there, I'll let you know, or we can have a discussion about it. But a patient should have some say in what is in there. If there are certain boundaries, you're like, I have to put this in there, and here's why. Set it up at the beginning. Here are the things that need to be in your medical record. If I do an exam, it needs to be in there. I need to put these things in your medical record. Here are the things that if you talk to me about, I don't necessarily need to put in there. Set it up at the beginning. Think about it ahead of time. What are you willing to put in? What are you not willing to put in? If somebody shares something with you that you think, I'm okay putting in, I don't need to put in, you can ask, how do you feel about me putting that in the medical record? I'd like to put it in there so I remember to bring it up with you the next time we meet. Because sometimes that's why we do put it in there, right? Because we want to follow up and we're not going to remember. So just let it be known why you're putting it in there. What needs to be in there and is not negotiable, but what other things don't need to be in there. Just give some transparency. Because a lot of things on the patient side of things, we don't understand. We just see type, 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 and we have no idea what it's in there, what it looks like. What are you even writing about the patient? I don't know. So that's what's going on. That's how the political side might be affecting your patient. That's how the political side might be affecting your relationship with your patient. And that's how you can improve the relationship with all your patients, is by being transparent about what you put in the medical records and why. Because transparency matters.